As the psalmist has told us, the Lord hears. We've just read from the Psalms out loud and together, and I love these shared readings. There's something really powerful about reading out loud with a whole room of people who are tracing the same words with their eyes and with their minds and their voices. It is a moment of unity, indeed, though in such moments I can always hear, as I'm sure you do, the peculiarities of those voices around me, a unique intonation or an extended pause, a striking pronunciation of a word, a hesitant encounter with some strange syntax. Voices, each reading in a unique way, that become a shared offering of sacred words. And the Lord hears. The 34th Psalm, which we've just read, has an interesting textual history, one that I only just discovered and paid any attention to over this last week as I prepared for our time this morning. This history includes a rather strange origin tale, which you'll hear in a moment, and powerful returns and adaptations separated by centuries. It spans the words of the King David, the prophet Samuel, and the apostle Peter. As I read and reread the psalm through the lens of this long textual history, the voice of the poem became richer, fuller. It became not one, but a chorus of voices, layers of voices crying out at different times and places with these same words, just as we have done this morning. And the Lord hears. The first voice of the psalm is the I, the psalmist, the first person speaker in this sacred poem. And it is very clearly a voice of praise and devotion. It speaks in declarations of love and loyalty and submission and fear and praise for God. These declarations orient the psalm from the very first line, I will bless the Lord at all times. The confidence of this declaration only seems to grow throughout the psalm as the speaker invites others to join in the praise, saying, "Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt the Lord together." And then goes on to list knowingly the ways of the righteous who seek, fear, and praise the divine Creator, saying, "Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it." As the psalm grows, however, this same voice of praise is tinged by the memories of a poor soul. It contains a faint and distant sorrow, a remembered cry to God for help, a lament of how long, as Darwin just sang for us this morning. Now, we don't hear this cry very clearly in the psalm. It is a distant cry. It is a quiet remnant of suffering, replaced in the now by the voice of confident praise. But once heard, however quietly, that cry begins to fill the poem. It is underneath and around every moment of hope and praise. It is a psalm of deliverance because there has been great suffering. The singular I, the speaker of this psalm, is in this way a doubled voice. It contains simultaneously what Christine Brown-Jones describes as the dual faces of righteousness that are proclaimed, as she sees it, throughout the Psalms. According to Jones, the Psalter imagines the righteous in two very different ways. The righteous are those who, compelled to praise, seek life and protection and provision from God alone. The righteous are also those who are impoverished by the abuses of society, those who cry out to God for help because, in Jones's words, they do not have the means with which to help themselves. As Jones describes it, Psalm 34 contains both the assured voice of righteous praise, and the lamenting voice of righteous suffering. And the Lord hears them both. We can hear the cry more clearly in the psalmist's voice. We can begin to understand the suffering and thus the deliverance contained in the psalm if we travel outside the psalm itself to that strange origin tale of a fated king gone mad. The psalm begins with a somewhat strange narrative heading, one that I'm not sure is included in our reading in the printout. But we are told before verse 1 begins that this psalm is of David, when he feigned madness before Abimelech so that he drove him out and he went away. Now, this is a strange heading, and it's one that has been dismissed by many scholars, by many readers, who consider it an obvious incoherence, a copy editing mistake, since the psalm makes no explicit reference to this particular dramatic moment in David's life. For others, however, including the ancient Hebrew readers, many early Christian church leaders, and recent scholars like Rabbi Apple, whose work I'm going to draw on here, this striking heading creates an important narrative context for what might otherwise be, what has been said, a general cliche, and some have even dared to say bad poem in Psalm 34. I won't go into the poetic value of it. The heading refers, it seems, to an incident that is described very briefly in 1 Samuel 21, 11 through 16, if you want to turn there and look. In this passage, 1 Samuel 21, 11 to 16, a young David is on the run. He's left family and home to escape a jealous and dangerous King Saul. David runs, surprisingly to me, to the Philistine city of Gath, a stronghold of the people that David defeats again and again in the book of 1 Samuel, much to Saul's jealous despair, and Gath, the home city of Goliath, who we all know David, in his most famed moment, defeated. Alone in a dangerous land, unable to return to an even more dangerous home, David, we are told in 1 Samuel 21:13, changed his behavior, pretended to be mad, scratched marks on the doors of the gate, and let his spittle run down his beard. This pretense, which is translated in the Psalm 34 heading as a performance of madness, works. The Philistine king just shoos David away rather than killing him, and in the very next chapter, the Israelite escapes to a cave. He's reunited with his family, and he recruits an army of the poor, the distressed, the discontented, and continues on his fated journey to kingship. In this context, the psalm that we've just read becomes not only a universal song of praise or song of deliverance, but also a very particular song of the exile, whose cry for help from a foreign land has been heard by the Lord. It is a cry that comes from the particular experience of exile. A man who is cut off from his family, from his friends, from his home, who is inhabiting a precarious position in a new and unknown land, forced there to take extreme and even duplicitous measures to survive. Within this context of exile, we might hear the final promise made near the end of Psalm in verse 22 that none of those who take refuge in the Lord will be condemned. We might take it as a promise of home. We as a contemporary church are likely familiar with the idea of the Lord as our refuge. But I speculate that for many of us, including me, that refuge often feels abstract, very spirited and intangible. The speaker of this psalm, though, our exiled David, finds divine refuge, finds home in the tangible as well. He finds it in a cave, in a family restored, in comrades who come to surround him. And the Lord hears. In this context, the psalm rises as a song of exiled suffering and deliverance. It seems clear that early church leaders who turned often to this psalm, reading it communally just as we have done this morning, and weaving it into their own writing, took this context seriously and read this psalm as an exile song. Peter, for example, in his first epistle, offers the most recognized early church return to Psalm 34. The book of 1 Peter showcases Peter's particular affinity for the Old Testament and the Psalms in particular. This book of only 5 chapters, a very small book, includes more Old Testament references than any other New Testament book, excepting Revelations. And 1 Peter cites Psalm 34 in particular not once, but twice. And the longest citation in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, if you have interest in looking there, Peter quotes, with some minor revision, verses 12 through 14 in the Psalms. Those who desire life and desire to see good days, let them keep their tongues from evil and their lips from speaking deceit. Let them turn away from evil and do good. Let them seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Here Peter offers these words, quite purposefully it seems, to a very particular reader of his short letter, a New Testament community of dispersed Christians, aliens and exiles, who are named just that in chapter 2 of 1 Peter, who are living under the threat of Nero's violence and in fear of skeptical neighbors in a strange land. As Eric James Giroux has said, Peter quotes from Psalm 34 because his exiled and righteous readers, like the exiled and righteous psalmist, may suffer affliction and tribulation, but they can also rejoice that they will experience the good life and taste the Lord's kindness in spite of suffering. Peter turns to an ancient psalm of exile and deliverance to help envision another deliverance centuries later for those in the exiled church. And the Lord hears. Now, with this textual history in place, let me now speak boldly. Let me suggest another recasting of Psalm 34 for us here and now. Just as Peter took on the voice of the exiled psalmist for his persecuted and exiled readers, I wonder who else we can invite into this sacred passage. What other voice we might be willing to hear? Who we might hear calling out in that same voice to God today? Because we each bring a very different set of experiences, different minds, and different emotions to our reading of this sacred text, we each probably hear a very different exiled voice calling out. Perhaps you hear the persecuted church today continuing to cry out, and the Lord hears. Perhaps you hear the queer Christian continuing to reach out to God, and the Lord hears. Perhaps you hear the one homeless in her own body, living with debilitating depression or anxiety, cancer or assault or violation, but calling out to God, and the Lord hears. Perhaps you hear the one made to feel small, exiled from her place at the family table, the church table, because too liberal or too conservative or too young or too old or too rich or too poor, yet calling out to God, and the Lord hears. And perhaps you hear yourself in your own unique experience of exile, calling out to God, and the Lord hears. Let me tell you, if I may, who I hear in this psalm today. I hear one of the more than 68.5 million displaced men, women, and children who, as poet Warson Shire has written, leave home reluctantly and desperately and hopefully because home is the mouth of a shark. As a professor of American literature, which I had to get my poetry in there, that's the only one, I promise, and as a follower of Christ, my professional interests in the literary expressions of the U.S.-Mexico border have also become a spiritual commitment. So let me speak, if you will, from what I know. The border that I have come to know by way of artists and writers is not the geographic national boundary turned war zone we so often hear about from journalists and politicians. It is a sacred place, a homeland for, among others, an exiled people, a moving people in search of the deliverance that our psalmist so powerfully described in words that we have heard and read together this morning. These are a people too often dehumanized, both by those who vilify them as criminals and those who valorize them as impossible heroes. Border theologian Jacqueline Hagan rejects such a simple binary of villain and hero to tell a different story of those exiled thousands moving through the border. They are not, or not only, undocumented trespassers or economic liabilities or committed workforce, but they are people of faith, fellow Christians, Protestants and Catholics calling out to God, and the Lord hears. Hagan invites us to see the man or woman or child walking through the border and into the deadly desert as a man or woman or child walking in faith. In her words, for many migrants, their religion reinforces their decision to migrate and fortifies them psychologically and spiritually to prepare for the hardships of the journey. It also sanctions what is otherwise defined as an illegal act by the state. They leave home because home is indeed the mouth of a shark. And they walk toward a new home that is at least in part a divine promise. Sadly, unlike our psalmist, too many of those exiled do not survive their journey. There's a remarkable short film by documentarian Mark Silver that follows a small unit of overworked forensic scientists who are charged with identifying, often impossibly, the remains of those who have died in the deserts of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. As part of this work, these scientists examine those things that these men and women and children carried with them into the desert. Some are utilitarian: a toothbrush, a bottle of water, a lighter. Some are emotional: family photographs and wedding rings. And many of these things are sacred: rosaries and small Bibles clutched by dying hands. A priest who daily prays with migrants at the border explains it this way: it is very important for the migrants to have something religious to carry with them. You see, it represents the presence of God with them, which they never seem to doubt. The presence of God is certain with the migrants. Just as the psalmist voices both righteous praise and righteous suffering, just as we have echoed that righteous praise and righteous suffering in our reading this morning, our borderlands are filled with the voices of thousands confidently calling out in that same righteous praise and righteous suffering. And the Lord hears. And may we hear as well. Now, I want to walk humbly here. I've been invited to stand in front of you this morning, and I know the charges that you might raise, that I've brought politics into our sacred text, into our sacred space. But I believe deeply that what we often call political is, in fact, sacred. I implore us to listen carefully and deeply to all the voices that fill the word of our God. The voice of an ancient, fated king on the run for his life, a young and desperate and homeless church living in persecution in a foreign land, and in my own listening, a border-crossing people armed with Bible and rosary and prayer, holding to the promise of deliverance. and the Lord hears. May we listen bravely, and may we do bravely as we encounter the words of the exile calling out the promise of deliverance again. I will bless the Lord at all times. Praise shall continually be in my mouth. I sought the Lord, and the Lord answered me, and delivered me from all my fears. Look to the Lord, and be radiant, so your faces shall never be ashamed. O taste and see that the Lord is good. Happy are those who take refuge in the Lord. When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and rescues them from all their troubles. May it be so.